Hello and a very warm welcome to our session on a new global trade regime reform of the WTO. It's a real pleasure to host this session and welcome all of you here in the room and of course also in the live stream. And for those that are on the live stream, for you to know, we have about, I would say, 40 people here in the audience physically present. And I hope many, many more online watching this session. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She is, now I see you. Welcome to you, Ngozi. It's such a pleasure to see you. So Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is the Director General of the World Trade Organization. She's an economist and international development expert and served twice as Nigeria's finance minister and had also very senior roles in international health, such as being on the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and more recently she has been one of the co-chairs of the high-level independent panel on pandemic prevention, on the financing of pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. And I had the pleasure to be one of the panelists working under Ngozi's guidance in the last couple of months and truly enjoyed that experience. Now, today we are not primarily talking about the health response, the global international health response, but we want to talk about the WTO and the state of the global trading system. And Ngozi, and before I turn to you, Ngozi, before I forget, let me say, if you want to ask a question, be that you here in the audience or be it in the online audience, you should go on Slido and type in the code BAM, Bruegel Annual Meeting 21 Reform. And then you can ask your questions, and I will see your questions coming up and will be able to read them to the Director General of the WTO. So Ngozi, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you with us. And you know, perhaps to start to kick us off, I wanted to hear from you after 6 months in office. Where do you see the main challenges of the WTO, and you know, what are your plans in the coming months to address those?
Well, thank you, Guntram, and it's a pleasure to be with you at this Bruegel annual meeting. That's a very, very interesting question, coming in as I've done at the time of the pandemic and a few other global challenges. But I think before I talk about the challenges of the WTO and how I see them, I just want to say that one of the things that attracted me to run for this position is something that I really want to bring back to the WTO. If you look at the WTO's purpose, as stated in the Marrakesh Agreement, which set it up in 1995, it says the WTO is to help enhance living standards, create employment, and support sustainable development. And that whole set of that purpose, for me, it's just about people. And it's as valid then, now, even more valid now than then. But what I think has happened at the WTO is sometimes that purpose, it seems to have been forgotten. And that is why there have been so many challenges, and the WTO has not been able to have as many successes in its negotiating function. As one would like. So I sometimes say that whilst I have nothing against trade lawyers and their negotiations, you know, the WTO may have become more of a negotiating forum than a forum to deliver for people. So the first challenge I see is restoring the centrality of purpose and values for this organization. Once we know that the organization is about people, then it will not take us 20 years to negotiate an agreement. We have agreements in agriculture and fisheries, which have been ongoing, the negotiations for 20 years. You cannot do that if it's about people. So I think that's the biggest challenge that I see, to get recognition that we're here to serve people, and the ordinary person on the street must know what the WTO is about, because trade involves everybody. Even in my village in Nigeria, people trade with each other. So it's something that should be understood, and it should serve people. So that's the first thing. So in these 6 months, I've found an organization, I think, that is also doing having far more impact than people maybe would think or believe. But it could do much more. The biggest challenge, I think, facing the WTO, and apart from the one I've said, is how do we use the instruments and policies of the WTO to help solve the global problems? We have several problems of the global commons that we are now confronting. We've got the pandemic. How does trade, the multilateral trading system and its fair rules, and the WTO and the rules that it puts in place, how do they support a solution to this pandemic? And we found that the WTO can be really instrumental. The WTO monitors, in a way, supply chains, what happens to supply chains for goods and services. And we're talking of vaccines, for instance. It's our members who have export restrictions and prohibitions that impinge on supply chains. And so if we can lower those, it's easier for when you're manufacturing vaccines for inputs to move and for outputs to move. So this is a very important area, and I'll just illustrate it more. So since my coming, we've reached out to the vaccine manufacturers, because the tremendous inequity of access to vaccines that is prevalent in the world now, where 2% of people in low-income countries have been vaccinated and 50% on average in rich countries, is not acceptable, morally, ethically, or even economically. So how does WTO help to solve that? If we work with the manufacturers to look at supply chain issues, where are the blockages? How can we work with them? Where can they invest so we can produce more? What are their distribution schedules, and what are the difficulties they're encountering? We could help really move things. And this is what we've been doing. We've convened 2 meetings of manufacturers. We're doing another one tomorrow. All the CEOs of all the vaccine manufacturers are going to be there, so we can talk about these problems and how we can do more for the world. So that's one. There are other areas where I think the WTO faces challenges to update its rules, to modernize its rules and systems. But before I go there, let me just say that the WTO needs to be seen to be completing at least one multilateral negotiations, because it hasn't done that for 20 years. So we have something very important with respect to fisheries, removing harmful fisheries subsidies that lead to overfishing, and trying to help the sustainability of our oceans. So we are pushing to have that, to see if that can be completed. This is actually SDG 14.6, and the deadline to complete the negotiations was December last year. So we are pushing to have that done. That would give the organization a very important contribution to issues of sustainability, even issues of climate. And then I come back to updating of our rules. The challenge is that some of our rules that were made when the WTO first started or during the Uruguay round are now perhaps need to be updated. To be made more fit for purpose. We have the subsidies and countervailing measures agreement, which needs to be updated to recognize the way that economies have been evolving. We now have the case that we are going digital in the world. So e-commerce is key. And we don't have rules that underpin e-commerce. So those are things we need to look at. Finally, we have the challenge of our dispute settlement system, which has been paralyzed. This is the only forum in the world where members can bring, sort of cases against each other with respect to trade. And they're still doing that. We have a 2-tier system, the panel system and the appellate body. The appellate body has not worked for some time because, of the difficulties that some members have with the way it functions. But members are still bringing cases to the panel. But we need to reform this, modernize it so we can really deliver, for the members. So I'm just stating a few areas. I haven't even touched on how we have to modernize to deal with climate change. How does trade and WTO rules contribute to net zero by 2050? I believe we can, we should be doing this. How does trade contribute to inclusion? Some people have been left behind by globalization. Not really only the fault of trade, but also of technology, but trade can be a part of the solution to bringing in people and countries that have been marginalized. So you can see very exciting challenges going forward, looking at what is the future of trade and how does the WTO fit into that.
Thank you so much, Ngozi, for this first overview. And you touched on really a lot of different issues. And I think we can take the next 30 minutes to unpack some of those issues and go into some depths. And I really wanted to start with the issue of vaccines and medical supplies, because you mentioned it also quite early in your intervention. And I know that it's something that's very dear to your heart, and I think it should be dear to all of our hearts. As you rightly pointed out, it's not just a moral obligation, but it's even an economic necessity to get the world vaccinated as quickly as possible. Now, looking at what has happened is that very few advanced economies have exported significant amounts of vaccines. The European Union actually stands out as one of the big players that has exported a lot of vaccines. Other countries have done far less so. And of course, it's not just about the export of the vaccine, the final vaccines, but it's also about the supply chains. And last but not least, about technology transfer and the issue of additional vaccine production sites outside of the industrial economies and the advanced economies. Where do you see all of this going in the next let's say 12 to 18 months? Yesterday, in our panel on our CLIP group, the majority of our audience was actually quite skeptical that we would be able to vaccinate 70% of, or let's say that we would be able to vaccinate the world population by the end of 22. I think more than 70% were thinking it will be not feasible, but that's really an unacceptable result. So what can we do concretely, and what do you think we can do concretely to accelerate production and accelerate distribution, and what role can the WTO really play in this?
Well, thank you. I think that is the central question of our times. And I just want to say that four institutions, international organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, and the WTO have come together to try and work together to help solve this problem. The IMF did a study that it released a few weeks ago, in which it argued and demonstrated that if we spend $50 billion, we could vaccinate up to 40% of the world population this year and 60% next year. And if we try to do that, we could actually put the world on the path to a sustainable recovery. Now, this amount of resources is so tiny compared to the trillions of dollars that has been spent in fiscal stimulus by the rich countries. I mean, some countries have spent up to 28% of GDP on fiscal stimulus, trillions and trillions of dollars, and we're still counting. Now, if we were good at prevention and preparedness and had spent a few $1 billion to get ready, we wouldn't be spending trillions now. But even now, if we spend this amount, we could do so much more to help the world get back on a sustainable path and stop people dying. So that's just to set the context. So I think we need to look at several issues. the world used to produce about 5 billion doses of vaccines, and most of them were for children. And that's what Gavi was the largest procurer of vaccines for children in the world, about 60%. Now with this COVID, it became evident that one would need to produce 2 to 3 times that, maybe 12 to 15 billion doses. But if you're talking about boosters, it could even go to 20 billion and more. The point is that the world was not set up, did not have the manufacturing capacity to produce this vast number. So there's a supply scarcity issue. And so a push to try to increase this production is what is really needed at the moment. The second thing is that once there's production, equitable sharing of this output is important. What we have now is that rich countries have mainly bought up most of the output that is being produced, so that COVAX, the facility that we developed to try and serve 92 poor countries in the world, even though it has money, sometimes it cannot get the supplies needed. So what we advocate, and yes, some countries have been, and we need to commend them, exporting to other parts of the world. So like you said, the EU has been doing that, India has done that, China has done that. These are really the 3 larger ones, and I think the US is beginning to export too. But exports are concentrated in 10 developed countries, 80% of exports. So there are all sorts of issues to do with vaccines. But let me get back. First, we need to focus on increasing production. That means we need to work with manufacturers to see what are the issues on the supply chains. Remember that Pfizer-BioNTech said their supply chain is made up of 280 components manufactured at 86 sites in 19 countries. And AstraZeneca has supply chains across 12 countries, Johnson & Johnson, I think, across 15. So these are very complicated supply chains, and anything that stops them, so you can't get one component, means you can't produce. So the WTO is very instrumental in trying to see what are the issues with these supply chains? How do we help unlock them so we can produce? That's one issue. The second is working with the manufacturers to help invest more, deconcentrate the production of vaccines. You can't have a situation in which Africa, for instance, imports 99% of the vaccines it uses, 90% of its pharmaceuticals. This is a continent of 1.3 billion people. So when, for instance, you have a political issue where a country decides they're going to block exports, if you're depending on that to get your vaccines, you're stuck. So we must use this pandemic, the lessons learned, to invest more in these countries. And the manufacturers, we're working with them. They are coming forward. At the last meeting we had, Pfizer announced a $100 million investment in South Africa. Just last week, they announced a partnership with a company in Brazil to produce their vaccines. Other manufacturers are also reaching out, and we're beginning to look at investments. So that's one. The third part of this is technology transfer, and this is where intellectual property comes in. Of course, at the WTO, 164 members are debating the intellectual property issues. We have more than 100 developing countries who want to have a waiver of the agreement we have here on technology, on intellectual property transfer, because they believe that this would make manufacturing these vaccines easier and faster. There are those on the other side who say, look, this might not be the case, it might not work, and it would damage the incentives for research and innovation. Of course, my role, as I often tell people, is not to take one side or the other, is to try and bring our members together. But it's very clear in my mind that we have the solutions to keep people from dying. So the sooner we sit down and get an agreement, and I'm happy to say we're negotiating text on this now, but it's not moving very fast. There are many difficulties, but we have to work on getting at least technology transfer. Whilst this IP debate is going on, let's open more production facilities in both developed and developing countries. Let us get transfer of know-how, because you still need that. Even if you get IP, you still need the companies to transfer know-how for you to be able to manufacture vaccines, which is more complicated than therapeutics. So these are the things we have to do. In the short term, we are urging countries that have a surplus. We believe that some countries have paid for more vaccines than they actually need. And we're urging them to either donate or swap these doses so that people in developing countries can get even the first dose. Where some countries are doing booster doses when others have not even had the first dose of a vaccine, and ultimately self-defeating. Because if we don't get the bulk of people vaccinated all over the world, the variants will continue to multiply and come back to haunt us. So let me leave it there for now.
No, thank you very much, and thank you also for mentioning the initiative in South Africa of the BioNTech Pfizer factory that was also supported by France and Germany, and which I think is an important initiative to, as you say, decentralize production. But can I push you just on the role of the WTO before moving to the next topic very quickly? Obviously, the WTO doesn't have the money and can call for more distribution. But what about the TRIPS agreement and the capacity of countries to essentially use intellectual property in case of a health emergency? Is there a scope to do more and use that more, that clause, or how do you see that?
Well, first, I want to draw your attention, Guntram, to a mistake that a lot of people, or just the way they read the situation. There's a lot of focus on money and financing. But sometimes money is not the problem. The problem is you may have money, but there's no output to purchase because production is short because of these supply chain issues I mentioned. So I think the world needs to pay really strong attention to what's happening with supply chains. And that's where the WTO comes in, because we can monitor, we have a monitoring function on the things that impede supply chains, like export restrictions and prohibitions. We also have our members who can put in trade facilitating measures, which many of them have done to ensure that there's a smoother flow of vaccines. So the WTO's role in that has now been quite acknowledged by leaders all over the world. And we're really playing it, trying to work with manufacturers to lift those so that we don't have money, but we have nothing to purchase. So that's a very important point. Second point is about this issue. This is where the agreement on intellectual property and patents, this is where we have the agreement. And as I mentioned earlier, of course, the WTO, if we can come to agreement that on technology transfer and IP for production of these vaccines, that would be a net contribution. But of course, it's a very tough issue as members negotiate this. What I'm saying is that we can come to, I see the scope to really come to a practical agreement. And I was actually hoping that by July, we would be very close to it because people are dying. So we are pushing to get that agreement. In the meantime, we can work with companies to license voluntarily companies in developing countries to produce more. And we're also pushing them to do that. That's a contribution we can make.
Okay, let's move to another big topic, global commons, a global public good, which is climate change. And I think the one perspective that where I really would love to hear from you is about the very difficult issue of the carbon border adjustment mechanism and what it all means for the global trading system. As you know, there is a very active debate in the European Union, and there's very concrete legislative proposals and ideas in Europe to complement the domestic taxation of carbon emissions by an external adjustment mechanism to ensure the level playing field between external producers and domestic producers when they sell products in the European market. And so in principle, if it's non-discriminatory, it should be fine with the WTO rules, but at the same time there's lots of questions raised, especially by developing countries, about whether this is not an indirect way of protecting and of protectionism for European industry. And so I really would love to hear from you. First of all, your assessment, and I think there's also a question from the audience by Pierre Gröning going in the same direction. Also asking about the Climate Club, really hearing from you, how do you see this divide between the developing and the developed countries on the emission reduction aims, on the carbon border adjustment in particular? And if you want to, of course, we would also love to hear from you. What is your first assessment of what the European Union plans to do?
Well, first, let me, Guntram, start by commending the European Union for what it's doing really on the issue of climate change and the global commons. We know this problem is here to stay, and we have to deal with it. And so the fact that the European Union is moving faster, advancing its targets, I think, now to get to 55% reduction by 2030, and trying to reach net zero before 2050. I think this is very commendable. Of course, as part of that effort, there's the issue of carbon pricing, which will help solve many problems. And as an economist, I would love to see a global carbon price. But that's not where we are now. Now we have very fragmented systems. We actually have 68 fragmented systems at the moment, of countries charging different prices and having different schemes ranging from less than $1 per ton, say in Ukraine, to $130 per ton in Sweden, and different mechanisms to deliver this, emission trading schemes. And now, of course, we have CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, coming into all that. So this is really not the best approach for the world. The best approach is to see how we can get globally, members of organizations together, get groups of the world, as we did for the Paris Accord, together to agree on a common approach to carbon pricing. So that's what really would be the ideal. And I think at some stage, the WTO, along with other organizations like the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank, stand a good chance of putting their heads together and trying to craft an approach that would be a good one for the world, better than what we have. So that's one point. That being said, we now have the European Union proposal for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. This proposal, we haven't seen the details of the design. I think it's still in the making. And the European Union does not expect to have those details till about late 2022, 2023. The devil is in the detail. It's when we see the design that we'll be able to say, does this accord with WTO rules or not? And as you mentioned, we do have to be sensitive to the fact that not just developing, there are some emerging markets that have signaled issues. Some developed countries themselves are not comfortable with the CBAM. And then, of course, there are developing countries that are apprehensive that this should not be turned into a non-tariff barrier protectionist measure to keep their trade out. So there are all these concerns, which means that in designing this, great attention has to be paid to these concerns. The fact that there's thinking to start with certain sectors, not an overall mechanism, but say the steel sector, to see how that will work, I think is a good way to look at it, because we have to think carefully. Developing countries, for example, you need to think of what kind of transition period they need in order to be able to manage all these issues of carbon pricing, phasing out of fossil fuels, contributing to net zero. The African continent contributes only 33% of emissions. So they would argue, we need a transition period. They're not arguing that we shouldn't contribute, but we can't be expected to move at the same pace as other countries. So in any design of any pricing mechanism, this has to be taken into account. I believe that if the CBAM is sensitive to some of these, to level playing field issues, making sure it's not a protectionist measure, but it's not against competition, and is sensitive to the concerns of developing countries, I think perhaps we could come up with something that would be workable. But it's premature for me to say that. I have to be very clear because we don't really know the outlines of this design. We are busy at the WTO trying to study this issue, see on the technical and legal side what it might imply. So it's very early days yet.
Thank you. Before we move to one other big discussion, which is China and the level playing field, I do want to ask you about very concretely the next ministerial conference of the WTO, so the MC12 conference. And there's also a question by Robert on exactly that. And, he's asking, which is the same question I wanted to ask you, is, what are your expectations, your realistic expectations for the MC12 conference? What is it that you want to achieve at that conference concretely? What is it both in terms of issues, but also in terms of rebuilding the reputation of the WTO, because as you mentioned, the WTO has lost some credibility because it didn't manage the negotiating many successes on the negotiating side, while at the same time the dispute settlement system itself is currently not really operational. So there's a reputation building aspect, but then there's also really concrete issues that you could achieve at the next ministerial conference. So what are your plans?
Well, let me say that the WTO is indeed beginning to restore its place and its reputation. If the feedback I get in the last few months, where the WTO has been quite instrumental in trying to get solutions to the pandemic issues, the production of vaccines, I think the WTO is now showing that it can be part of the solution to the world's problems. So I think we just need to move along those paths and say, for MC12, what realistically can we try to do? Because I believe the organization must have some successes. To do that, one has to focus very intently on a few areas, not on a Christmas tree approach to what we can get, because that is very ambitious. Given this pandemic, we are not 100% sure the format. We are still debating, and maybe in the next week we'll know the format that this MC12 will take. Will it be physical? Will it be virtual? And so on. And it's not just MC12. The ministerial meetings are not just meetings or conferences where people come. They're actually negotiating forum. It's very hard to negotiate by Zoom or by any other kind of device. Really, it's the conversations in the corridors, it's the little meetings you have at the side, it's the late night sessions where you come to agreement. So if this is not a physical meeting, it will become very difficult to say what we can, the things to be achieved. But nevertheless, that being said, and recognizing that, we focused intently on saying two things that are important. One, can we conclude the fisheries subsidies negotiations? This is one of the targets that we would like to do, and we're working very hard to try and see if even before the ministerial, we can have a very good understanding close to concluding or even concluding it so that ministers can just bless it at the ministerial or have very little to go over, given that the format is still up in the air. Now, this is still a tall order because we still have many differences between members, but there's a kind of momentum. We had a meeting of ministers, virtual one, July 15 of all trade ministers, and they gave the political backing and momentum for us, for ambassadors here to try to get to yes on fisheries. So I'm very much hoping this is something we can deliver that would really be important for the world, because remember, in 1970, 10% of the world's fish stocks were overfished. Today, it is 34%. If we don't get an agreement on this issue, where are we heading? So this is very important. The second area where I think we need to focus on is this area of response to the pandemic, as we term it at the WTO, trade and health issues. And I've illustrated clearly where the WTO can contribute to these issues. helping with export restrictions and prohibitions, helping with monitoring and pushing supply chain issues, solving them, working on this issue of technology transfer and IP. So if we get a strong declaration along those lines, and with maybe a work program to look at the other pending issues and solve them before MC13, I think that would be a reasonable outcome. Then, of course, we've got the agricultural negotiations that have been going on for some time. This is even more difficult than fisheries. So my expectations here are reasonable, or a reasonable check. But I still think we need some kind of package, because this is such an important sector for developing countries. So those are, three I'm looking at. Then on dispute settlement, yes, you mentioned this is a very important part of the WTO, as I said before. We are still quite some ways to seeing our way through to those reforms, but what we can look to is at least let us begin to build a common understanding by MC12 of what we want to reform in the dispute settlements mechanism that we have. I think that's a realistic expectation. We can't go too far, because we're still some of our members are still mulling over what type of reforms they want to see. And then we have some exciting new areas that I'd really like to touch upon. Trade. The future of trade is more in services than in goods. You see that trade in services is increasing, growing by leaps and bounds, whereas trade in goods is growing at a declining rate. So we need an agreement to govern services. And we have the Services Domestic Regulation, which is a plurilateral negotiation, meaning it's a subgroup of members, not every member. But this one has about 63 members, which is quite a good number. And recently the US joined. So it has about 80% of world trade in services as members. Now there's a chance we could get that concluded at MC12 or by MC12. We will get certain aspects of e-commerce. The e-commerce negotiations are also going on as a plurilateral, with about 86 or so members who have joined in this, and they're taking it step by step. I believe there are certain portions of that we can complete by MC12. Then we've got a working group on trade and gender. I believe strongly, very passionate about the issue of inclusion. And this is where trade can really do good. What can we do to make rules that would support women and micro, medium, and small enterprises in trade? What are the other mechanisms we can use to get women's enterprises onto national, regional, and global value chains? So there are some proposals that have been looked at, are coming up, and I hope that at MC12, we'll also have a strong declaration on the issue of women and trade and micro, medium, and small enterprises, which create the most jobs in every country in the world. How can we make a more level playing field for them and support them? So on climate, we are very early stages, as I said, but again, on issues of green, we have a working group that's just beginning looking at plastics. We're looking at how to revive the environmental goods and services negotiations so as to incentivize, renewables and other goods that are climate friendly. But there we have not advanced very much. So I've set out for you two or three concrete areas where we're expecting some results: trade and health, or in response to the pandemic, fisheries, and perhaps some package on agriculture. Then surrounding this, you now have all the other areas I've outlined, which are quite exciting, where we're making some efforts to advance issues.
Wonderful. So very, very concrete steps on which you want to see agreement, and then hopefully on some of the broader issues, at least the declaration of direction by the ministers that then provides for enough, let's say, basis to make progress, for example, on the dispute settlement or other issues. So that's going to be a very important conference, and of course we wish you a lot of success for that ministerial conference. Now, perhaps the last set of issues I want to raise is is really on China, the level playing field, and also the US-China trade conflict. And we have a question by one of the participants: how do you see the US-China trade dispute unfold? What is the impact on the WTO? And we have a question by Maria de Merzis, my colleague here at Bruegel, on what do you think what kind of change would you like to see implemented at the WTO to ensure that the level playing field between let's say companies outside of China and Chinese companies that operate in a different economic system can be assured, and do you see that actually as a problem or not in the first place? So if you could give us a sense of where you see sort of on the big picture US-China, but as also more concretely on the level playing field issue, where do you see the agenda in the next years, and what would be your priorities?
Well, there are issues, big issues between the US and China. And what I'd say is that there are issues that are very political and are not really WTO or trade issues, but of course, trade becomes an instrument to try to either solve those issues or take action on those issues. What I'd like us to focus on is those aspects that are trade related, because there are other bigger political issues which the WTO and trade measures get dragged into that are not really about trade. So that being said, yes, there are these tensions between the US and China. It has resulted sometimes in, some kind of tariff wars, and there are complaints on each side, not only from the two of them, but members. Developing countries, developed countries, even some developed countries with each other. The EU and the US have issues. So it's not just China, US, there's EU, US, there's EU, China, there's developing country, developed emerging markets. So we have issues, what we would call competitive neutrality, trying to get a level playing field for all. And there are two aspects of this where we are suffering from really issues of subsidies mounting. One area is agricultural subsidies, what we call domestic support. This is a very important area where we need to think about how to level the playing field for all. The other is the area of industrial subsidies, and this is where there's, people mentioned the issue of China and the subsidies to state-owned enterprises. But it's really a bigger problem of, beginning to see areas in which, the playing field is no longer level across the board. And there are even issues being brought up about the fiscal stimulus that we've seen during this crisis, and what that will mean if it's not withdrawn. Will that also become another issue in which countries are propping up their enterprises and not phasing them out after this situation is over? The last part of this is we're beginning to see industrial policy emerge, even in Western countries. Before, industrial policy was not such a good word. The market was supposed to be allowed to play, but now all over the world we see this. So I'm just saying all this to say that, look, beyond the China-US tensions, we have broad issues of competitive neutrality in many fields, and we have to try to solve them. I think the two big chapters are the agricultural domestic support and the industrial subsidies. What we are trying to see is to understand the issue much better, because if you look at it, you don't see too many studies that lay out the problem. But the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD and the WTO have come together to do a study across the board on these issues of these big subsidies, because it concerns all four institutions to see where are we and what steps can we take. So it's not just a WTO or trade issue. In addition to that, we're also trying to understand it better at the WTO. We strongly believe in at least knowing the facts of the situation in order to help us get a handle on it. Now, let me add that there's no doubt that some of the WTO instruments may not be up to date or fit for purpose to handle these issues. We have the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, which was put together during the Uruguay round. And in 1995, at the beginning of WTO, and which really did not take into account these issues in the way it should have. So the question is, how do we update or make these instruments, these rules, fit for purpose for the evolution of the world as it is today? You have to remember that in 2001, when China joined the WTO, if you look at GDP in 2010 constant dollar terms, China's GDP was $2.42 trillion. At that time, the US's GDP was 12.75 or 12.72 trillion. So China's GDP was 18% of the US. By 2019, in the same constant dollar terms, China's GDP is about $11.8 trillion and the US about 18 trillion. So if you look at it, this is now more than 2/3. And if you look at it in other terms, you might even see a larger number. So the situation with China has really, over 2 decades, evolved substantially. If you look at exports, and I'll stop at that, but it's interesting to look at these numbers. You know, in 2001, I think China's exports were about 36% of the US's in value terms. Today, they're about 180%. So these are large changes. And therefore, the world is evolving, and we need to look at what this means with respect to our rules and make them, update them to take account of these issues. So that's what I'd like to say. It's not just focusing on competitive neutrality, really goes quite deeper than what we sometimes hear. Yes, it involves China, US, but it goes much broader than that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. The last point is, of course, a very, very important and difficult discussion, and this issue of competitive neutrality is also very dear to research here at Bruegel. My colleague Alicia Garcia Herrero has also done some research in that space, and we are looking also actively into the ownership structure in China and what it all means for global trading relations with research, upcoming research by my colleague Nicolas Veron. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Ngozi, it's been such a pleasure and honor to host you today. You spared a lot of time with us, a lot of thinking. We wish you really a lot of success for the upcoming ministerial conference. And of course, a lot of success to the WTO, because for Europe, the multilateral trading system is really of essential importance, and we want it to work. And so, so this is a very important agenda also for Europe. And so, thank you so much for being with us, sharing your thoughts, and for our audience for engaging with us. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Guntram. Bye bye.
Bye bye.